Bernida, a Michigan sailing legend, by Al Declercq and Tom Ervin, with Gloria Whelan, and illustrated by David Miles. Luke thought the island might tip right over into Lake Huron. It seemed like the whole town was standing with him at the shore's edge, cheering for Bernida. Luke listened for the cannon that would signal the winner of the race. Luke lived on Michigan's Mackinac Island. When you live on an island, water is your world. He loved the giant freighters and the ferry boats with their rooster tails of spray. Best of all were the sailboats that skimmed like gulls over the lake. His grandfather had taught Luke to sail. It was his grandfather who told him about the amazing adventures of the sailboat Bernida. Bernida was 93 years old, the same age his grandfather would be if he was still there. He was gone now, and Luke wanted the Bernida to win for his grandfather. Bernida had begun her racing life in 1921 on the Atlantic Ocean. Gales tossed her about. Great waves washed over her. One day, a sailor named Russ fell in love with a sailboat. He bought the boat and brought her to the Bayview Yacht Club in Detroit. When he took the Bernida out sailing on the Detroit River, she tipped over, and his friends laughed. Russ knew boats, and he knew it was wrong. To keep her from tipping over, he moved some of the lead ballast from inside the Bernida to the bottom of the keel. Now the sailboat didn't tip over anymore. When the boat began to win races, the sailor's friends stopped laughing. He decided to enter the Bernida in what would be the very first race from Port Huron, just north of Detroit, all the way to Mackinac Island at the tip of Lake Huron. There were 12 sailboats in the 250-mile race. There were thunder squalls and waves 6 feet high. 8 of the 12 boats gave up, but not Bernida. She made history winning the race. Luke imagined the excitement on the island in the year of 1925. 2 years later, she won again. But the next year the rules changed. Bernida wasn't allowed to race. Her racing days were over. Bernida was left in a barn, and no one cared about her. Her boards shrunk, her paint peeled, mice skittered all over her. A quarter of a century went by. At last, a man named John bought her, but Bernida wasn't a racing boat anymore. She was living a quiet life on a lake. One day, she was pulled out of the lake and set down next to the highway with a for sale sign. But instead of being sold, Bernida was donated to a children's camp. Soon, she was back in another lake. Children learned how to sail on Bernida. Then, a young man named Jeff discovered her famous past as a racing boat. He had to have her. The only problem was Jeff didn't know how to sail. But he loved Bernida so much that he taught himself how to sail. There were close calls and mistakes, but he was sailing. Luke didn't know how it would be possible, but Jeff, tired of sailing, sold Bernida to a junk dealer. Once more, her sailing days were over. Luke imagined the beautiful boat all dusty and full of cobwebs, forgotten, and miles from the water she was built for. Once again, Bernida was discovered. 2 men from the Mackinac Island Yacht Club bought her. Something about her old beauty and clean lines drew them to the boat. They wanted her rebuilt and racing again, but that cost money. They took Bernida back to Mackinac Island and placed the sailboat in front of the famous Grand Hotel. There was a sign on her urging people to contribute money so she could sail again. Luke's grandfather took Luke to see the boat. They stood there together while the grandfather told Bernida's story. His grandfather didn't have much money, but he donated what he could afford. Every week Luke was there, he gave half his allowance to Bernida. Enough money was finally collected to begin Bernida's restoration. The sailboat was given to a shipbuilder named Emery. For 18 months he worked away. Emery wanted to be sure Bernida met all the qualifications so she could race again. The islanders came to watch. Luke stopped by on his way home from school. Along with other volunteers on the island, Luke scraped off old paint and helped with the sanding. Bernida was given new planks and ribs. Luke was sure by any day now the boat would be back in Lake Huron. But then, Emery ran out of money. Luke learned that he was offering Bernida for sale on the internet. And Luke hurried home and turned on the computer. There was an ad on eBay. Luke counted the money he had from his birthday and the money he had earned working in the stables caring for the horses. There were no cars on Mackinac Island, only horses and carriages. His grandfather had recently passed away. Luke looked at the gold pocket watch that had been left to him. He knew he would never sell that. Bernida cost thousands of dollars. Luke could never buy her. Someone else saw the ad on eBay. Before the auction was over, a sailmaker named Al bought the boat. Luke was sure that was a good sign, because sails were one of the most important things on a sailboat. He heard that Al was designing a very special spinnaker for Bernida. Luke was sure Bernida would race again, and this time he would be there to see it. When Bernida was ready, she was sent to the Bayview Yacht Club in Detroit. She was racing on the Detroit River. The sailors at the Bayview Yacht Club had been sailing a long time. If you sailed the Mackinac Race 25 times, you were an old goat. If you sailed the race 50 times, you were a grand ram. The sailors cheered for Bernida. At last, she was ready to enter the 2012 Mackinac Race. It had been 85 years since Bernida had last won the race back in 1927. Could she win again? There had been 12 boats in the first race in 1925. This time, there were over 200. The sailboats were divided into classes according to their ratings. There were 14 boats sailing in Bernida's class. Many of them were slick and fancy. Bernida had a small crew of 3 fathers and their 3 sons, including Al the sailmaker who had purchased her. The crew wanted the boat to be as much like the original sailboat as possible, so there was no motor, no seats, and only a narrow space for the 2 of the crew to sleep at any one time. At noon on Saturday, July 14, 2012, Bernida set sail once more in the race to Mackinac. Saturday night, Luke couldn't close his eyes. A storm come up on Lake Huron. He begged his parents to let him go down to the harbor to the race headquarters. Coast Guard reports would alert them to any trouble with the sailboats. This year, there wasn't the magic of transponders. Transponders send and receive signals from a satellite. Those signals would show the location of every sailboat. When Luke and his dad got down to the harbor, they learned that part on the top of Bernida's mast had been broken. Luckily, a crew member named Ken managed to climb to the mast in rough seas and fix it. But the storms continued, and on Sunday night, a crack opened up on Bernida's deck. The whole back part of the boat might break off. The boat might sink. The crew rigged the boat with smaller sails. The crack closed up, but still the rolling waves washed over the ship. Al was nearly washed overboard. But Bernida was ahead. There were northern lights striking through the skies that night. Luke was sure that was a good sign. He went home and even slept for a few hours. First thing Monday morning, Luke was down at the harbor with everyone else. He saw the families of Bernida's crew take off in a motorboat to greet and accompany the boat to the island. The cannon went off to signal that the winner had crossed the finish line. 87 years after the first Port Huron race to Mackinac Race, Bernida made sailing history by winning again. Everyone in the harbor was cheering. No one was cheering louder than Luke. Luke was sure that his grandfather was cheering Bernida too. George Owen, a professor of marine architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, designed Bernida. The sailboat was built in 1921 at the George Lawley and Sons shipyard in Boston. The Barnwell Boat Works on Mackinac Island restored Bernida. Declercq is the sailmaker who purchased her to race in the 2012 Port Huron to Mackinac Race. The winning crew in that race was Al Declercq and his son Matthew, Ken Flaska and his son Connor, and Fred Detweiler and his son Ward. Matthew and his grandfather Robert were very instrumental in updating Bernida, so that way she would be capable of winning the race. The bond they formed is something that will always be with them. Luke is a fictional character, but he represents all boys who love sailboats. The end.